Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. This is the second online lecture that was scheduled for this week. I would be sharing this with you on Friday morning. Mm, just before we get started on the recording and the lecture for this week, one or a couple of few things that I wanted to clarify. One is with respect to your book review and chapter review assignment, make sure that we have some of the texts available as in the form of ebook versions. I've put those up on the NV platform. Thanks to Dhruv. He was able to share a few of these available texts, but these are only 5 titles that were available. At the same time, I would request you to please make sure that you get started by identifying the book that you want to review, and at the same time, start by reading the text. Please make sure that you do not end up undertaking the assignment towards the end of the term. It will not be possible for you to complete a book review. Arranging a book or finding a book by its own may take a little bit of time. And as you already know, things are it's not easy to find things at very easy access and disposal, right? So it's better that you get started today. All right, for this week, our discussion on the last session was focused on the COVID-19 crisis and its largely or a broader macroeconomic impact. I want to go a little further to take our discussion forward this week. Uh, so we were looking at in the last session on what is that we know so far, right? Uh, and in terms of the outline, we were largely focusing our discussion on the first 2 points. That was on the timeline of the virus that it spread. How is that playing out? We still are, with every passing day, we're getting to know new things. Right now, a lot about testing and which kind of tests work, which two kind of tests do not work, how reliable are testing kits. I mean, a lot of those questions remain. Whether you have certain false negatives, how does that really change a person's ability to catch a virus or not catch the virus? Who's actually vulnerable, who's not? I mean, number of issues, and because the access of data, particularly in countries as large as India, is difficult to get at a more decentralized district level. I do sincerely believe that the next month, that is the month of May, is going to be extremely crucial as some states start relieving or relaxing the lockdown measures. The impact of the crisis, which has already been seen in India, rest of the world, China, US, something which we were discussing in the last session as well, is making it now almost inevitable that certain activities restore. But apart from the pandemic itself, as I was arguing last time, that there's also the pandemic of anxiety and fear, right? How much or how comfortable are people are going to be getting out, going to work, attending meetings in large numbers, or participating in events? Are you going to, for example, now prefer watching a movie in a theater, or would you prefer watching it at home? So the habits and behavior of people as individuals and as a group is something that is going to change, and that will define or redefine the preferences that we make or the choices we make going forward. So it's a very interesting time to be around. I mentioned this earlier that we are going to be. I mean, a few of us, and as I will include most of the students also in this category, that we're far more privileged to be able to have access to be able to take a step back, reflect on some of these issues, and analyze, integrate them better. But those who are really involved at responding to the crisis and are figuring things out. Imagine the fate of healthline workers or healthcare workers, doctors, nurses. Imagine the fate of those in the extreme vulnerable category, the poor. There's a very interesting line I was recently coming across in an article on how the crisis of the pandemic spread was exacerbated by those who own a passport, and the effect of that has been largely experienced by those who hold a ration card in India, right? So it's a very interesting analogy to be able to look at. So we're going to be focusing today on the last 3 points, the points that I was not able to cover last time. And I thought that before we move towards the core integral aspect of the curriculum, which is going to look at issues around money, prices, central banking, um, the macroeconomics of the open economy at a more conceptual level, it might be interesting to look at what's happening now. And I think some of you are already reading about some of these points of discussion. So this would come across as a more of a summated, aggregated view. I have put a lot of thoughts into the points that we're going to discuss today. So I will request you to take or go through this recording in parts, or alternatively go through it a couple of times before we have our session scheduled next uh, Monday, which is the Monday morning. We are going to be meeting on Monday morning to be able to have our discussion, which is the weekly discussion on the lecture. I was very happy that most of you were available, present for the session, and were able to ask some very interesting questions. I'll try addressing some of these questions in our discussion today. So let me start by going forward with the first point for our discussion today. And this is largely concerned with the points we were connected by talking about in the first week of our lecture, that what generally the discipline of economics seeks to do. You would recall our discussion in the first couple of weeks, which was talking about what economics as a discipline seeks to do, what economists as social engineers try to address some of the problems that are very fundamental to the questions that we look at in economic thinking, and what they actually end up doing, right? So those were the three key parts that we were looking at. Somewhere the crisis and the shock that we are facing right now is going to take us back to the basic questions, and these basic questions always remain. They don't disappear or they don't go away, but our ability to respond to them or resolve them quite often changes from one step to another. So you would recall the discussion we had in our first week, and I would just probably pause for a second for you to be able to take a look at some of these points that we had a very intensive discussion on. So if you would recall, the first few points that we were looking at, that economics as a discipline seeks to focus largely on addressing the scarcity problem that we have in terms of resources, the allocation of resources, and those are decisions that are embedded in the understanding that whether it's natural resources, mineral resources, or resource of time, as an endowment, all of these are scarce. You have as many hours in a day, you have as much of money that you can manage. There is no insatiability of resources that is available, right? And we come back to those questions again. A crisis imposes, for example, an individual now who's lost out on his job or her job, or has seen a fair amount of cut in his or her income, makes his or her ability to allocate resources in I mean, one would need to revisit those, right? One would have to look back at what choices one needs to prefer and not prefer. Does he or she need to go out and spend that much of money on eating food outside now as wages are cut, or probably cut down on those expenses? You will, for example, see now that a lot more people, particularly in the middle income group, lower middle income group category, are going to allocate a substantive part of their incomes towards savings, because whenever there is a shock like this, or a crisis, saving rates generally tend to go up. If those savings are put in banks, you will really have the numbers to be able to show that very clearly over a period of time. that is from household deposits that banks have. But apart from that, generally people tend to save more because they're more uncertain, there's more anxiety, there's more fear on what kind of costs may surface in the near future. So the second question, which is the question of the problem that generally it was, is the optimal utilization of resources, and that is going to be one of the major factors for many developing countries now, right? Where do you allocate more resources towards? Do you, in a crisis, you need to optimize whatever resources you have in terms of production, consumption, distribution, and that optimal utilization is something that is extremely important to be able to connect the third point, that is on producing efficiently. So you'd recall that this was something we discussed, and we discussed this in a kind of a non-crisis or in a more generic fundamental understanding what economics does. It's important to go back to some of these problems now when you are seeing that the economy or those who are working within the economy, different stakeholders, whether it's firms, governments, households, most of them are going to be facing with these choices or questions to make. What about redistribution, right? The question of redistribution is extremely critical because you have now a huge chunk of individuals, groups who are in the category of being poor from income or poor in terms of access to basic healthcare, education, and their degree of vulnerability is going to increase. And I want to give you an example. I was checking with a few people known to me who work in certain categories of vocations which you would deem as vulnerable category, right? And there were a couple of women who were generally discussing this at how they had put so much of effort to get their kids to start going to schools, right, and get the education which they couldn't get during their lifetime. And now that the schools are shut, most government schools are no longer able to facilitate classes. Private universities like ours have students who have smartphones, access to the best possible technical resources and capabilities to switch on classes online. Now government schools are doing the same thing. They're asking the most people and parents, even those living in rural areas or in spaces where they may not have, for example, access to a smartphone, to be able to take the sessions online, right? Even having a WhatsApp on the phone would require some kind of a smartphone where you'd be able to access. So for those who do not have access to a phone, basically you're almost denied access to education at this point of time. So you will see definitely a huge chunk of people for whom education was something that a lot of effort was done to be able to increase access to literacy, basic education, primary education, is going to be taken away because there is no option for classes and schools to resume. So this is a concern. The fact that you have production happening in certain select areas, how does redistribution of income takes place is a matter of concern. So some companies smartly, what they're trying to do is understand what their priorities are in terms of um, production or providing a service depending on the nature of the company, and they're accordingly taking a call on whether to cut down on the net income of certain groups to be able to allow for better distribution of resources, or alternatively do a focus on, let's say, not laying off people or letting go of a huge part of the workforce, but ensuring that at lower incomes as well, you maintain their position. This is going to affect the way we perceive well-being. Well-being is relative as a concept, like any other. So how I perceive my well-being as against someone else perceives his or her well-being. For me, having 4 meals or 5 meals a day would be considered as part of, okay, that's something which I consider as basic important thing. For a group of people who are, let's say, just right above the poverty line, having 2 meals a day in itself may be considered as maximizing their well-being. Now, how does those concepts really get challenged, right, in this matter of period? Minimizing of negative externalities, the content, the term externalities would be something that I would urge you to explore more on. how does COVID-19 as a shock impose or organize for increased positive externalities and negative externalities. Now, to give you an example, think of crimes of harassment or molestation against women, right? If there is observed social distancing, massive lockdown, a lot of crimes that we're seeing, harassment, molestation, as almost a kind of day-to-day normalized offense against women, that's something which has tapered to come down. But on the flip side, if that could be seen as a positive externality of of women not experiencing trauma or torture as a result of that kind of societal behavior, the other negative externality is that the amount of cases in domestic violence have gone up, which I think some of you would probably know that because of the lockdown, a lot of people who had issues at household level are now in a much more vulnerable category. And it's very little that agencies can do unless they don't prioritize it. Apart from that, more generally, I mean, it the way most firms, new individuals are going to view the possibility of minimizing negative externalities is going to take some amount of center stage now. Pollution will be a very important factor now. Climate change would occupy a far greater amount of precedence and interest of people who earlier was, let's say, in a category of not denial, or let's say, or those who were aggressively trying to sensitize the people, but in the middle somewhere, that, oh well, yeah, it's a concern, but we would rather probably worry about it some other day. That, I think, postponement of priority to an issue like climate change is, my understanding would be, it's going to be difficult. Ecological waste, biological harm, I mean, most of these are questions that a lot of people are asking, whether it is the origin of the virus, the spread of the virus. um, there are always theories about how and why an event happens, right? And there are some unknowns that one doesn't have a clear idea of what, unless there's substantive medical or empirical evidence to put it across. But generally speaking, if production activities were resulting in higher amounts of ecological waste and concerns, right? They firms' way of doing business is likely to be revisited. This was happening already. We're seeing in automobiles, for example, pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical testing, for example, was not happening in the same way, where you had, for example, 1,000 monkeys taken to be experimented upon. Uh, Animal welfare bodies and civil society groups were taking efforts in a number of countries to ensure that testing is done by causing minimum or least amount of harm to other species. At the same time, you have to look at concerns of production, which was resulting in larger ecological issues in the form of marine pollution, air pollution. So those things are going to, as policy priorities, take more precedence now. So these are what you would consider as the 6 critical questions that we started the course with, that still remain. And I think that is going to occupy a much larger point of discussion for everyone who's a stakeholder in the economy. As I said, whether it's a firm, whether it's a household, whether it's the government, whether it's the external sector, whether it's those who are exporting, each of these questions or each of these problems are going to be imposed, and the resolution towards it, or the answer towards it, is going to change as a result of the shock and its impact. We were discussing this in the last recording, that our focus on developing countries need to be at a far greater priority right now, because there are some countries which have taken decades and decades to be able to come out of high income or socioeconomic poverty or powerlessness, and had gone through a series of economic reforms that were able to make them to get better off, right? Now these countries are at the margins. Think of a country like Nigeria, which is dependent excessively on the export of oil. And now with oil prices almost going zero and negative, how does a country like Nigeria, bail itself out from a crisis like this? It's one of the largest and most populous countries also in the whole Africa, and was growing at the fastest rate. South Africa, a country like South Africa, which has already world's highest amount of unemployment, how does a lockdown or a prolonged lockdown affects its own economy? So it is likely to be seen that you have a situation now that affording a prolonged lockdown is not going to be possible for many countries. I would say, including India. Let's say post May 3rd, you will see that normalcy would have to return in some way or the other. Are we ready for restoring business as usual of sorts? I don't think so, but that's something which, I mean, the trade-offs need to be now mitigated towards, given the fact that the destruction of jobs. I mean, I was looking at the recent CMI numbers on employment. Almost 140 million people, 14 crores people in the organized sector alone, or the semi-organized sector, have lost their jobs. This is something which completely discounts on the impact that the crisis has had on the migrant labor force, which is somewhere around 40 to 45 million in its number. So this is 40, 45 million plus 140. So if 180 or 185 million people are out of the workforce, that means it's one of the most serious, unemployment crises of all times in our context of post-independent history. I have argued it elsewhere, and I've written about it, that this could be, I mean, at the time when the crisis was largely centered around China. My understanding was, if this would spread to different parts of the country, including a country like India, this would result in a crisis which is far worse than that of the Great Depression, and our own version of the Great Depression, as to say that almost one in every four people can actually result in becoming jobless. So this is a serious situation. I think most of you are aware. Social distancing is something which would be prioritized on, but well, it's possible in cities or areas which are sparsely populated, but not those where there's dense population. Surveillance, monitoring, ability to maintain social distancing, all of those things are extremely difficult. So ultimately, it's going to come down on how quickly you can find a vaccine, and how much of testing can you ensure at a more community decentralized level. I will focus mostly our discussion today on the third and the fifth point, that is on how supply chains are going to be affected as a part of the intra-domestic and inter-state relationship. Intra-domestic or intra-state means supply chains within the country and supply chains across the country. So that means at a global level, how do you see relationships of countries changing in terms of trade, mobility of goods and services? It started initially as a supply chain crisis, right? As you would know, most people were not aware of what was happening with the virus and its effect in China, but they were aware of the impact it was causing in supply chains, where China as a transit point was almost cut down. Ships that were coming in with goods from China were not being accepted in a number of countries. South Korea, United States were one of the kind of few countries which were taking a much hardened position. And that started triggering a panic in the stock market, because the future contracts, that means ability of me, if I'm a manufacturer of a certain product, tomorrow you will pay me thinking that in the future my contract is going to be obligated or enforced by me producing X number of units of products. So I mean, future contracts, the way it works very simply is, so a person who is my client buys 100 units of a product that I produce, pays me in advance, and I'm going to enforce the contract in the future by paying those 100 units back. But I've got the money well before. Those future contracts go for a complete toss when you have a crisis where supply chains get completely disrupted. And that created a huge panic in the stock market as well, because most companies were not able to supply their goods in time. Logistics became a huge concern. And this was almost true for any country which is dependent not only in China as a direct trade partner, but also a transient trade partner or transit trade partner to other countries in Southeast Asia and parts of you know Central and West Asia. So that's something which is important for us to look at. I'll look at it under the title of deglobalization or reglobalization today. The fourth point, which is the point on food insecurity and health insecurity, that is something which is troubling. A lot of people who had issues with respect to think of groups which had serious concerns of malnourishment, um, lack of adequate nutritional supplies, lack of access to better healthcare services. A lot of states with the resources now put towards addressing the pandemic are no longer able to put their focus on some of the other developmental issues that they were facing as challenges. So this is, at least in the short to medium term, at least for a few years' time, this is going to rise unless and until the situation would have been to boost, empower states at the local level to be given the amount of resources to continue their operations, and that has not happened, right? That has not happened across the board. The final point, which is one of the points I wanted to look at for our discussion today, and this is very critical for as a student of macroeconomics for you to know, is where and what kind of a next spilling over of a crisis may result in if developing countries which have limited fiscal space and capacity or are too dependent on the export or trade of one product, let's say oil or gold or one commodity, is going to excessively borrow to be able to meet the costs or healthcare costs out from a pandemic, or afford to be able to bail out companies. And that may result in a huge or massive accumulation of debt. I want to come back to this much later with some data that we want to look at. So let's look at how this crisis is now looking at readdressing some of the patterns of globalization that are likely to be affected. I've argued it before, and I think we had a good long discussion about this, that to say or make a statement that, oh well, globalization is going to go away, or people are not going to globalize or not move or travel, or goods and services not going to be traded. I mean, that's almost redundant to make a remark. In the world we live in today, as integrated it is financially, um, in terms of capital mobility, in terms of trade partnerships or trade contracts between countries, globalization is as real as gravity, right? This is not the early 20th century where still countries were in situations where they were not at all better integrated. There are very few countries today that you would consider. I mean, the closest example would be of North Korea, which does not have a larger trade partnership with countries across the world, right? Most countries, even smaller island nations, have some partnerships within regional actors. So the question is not much about whether globalization is going to withdraw itself, but whether the degree to which the integration levels were there, that knob is going to turn somewhere before. So if there was a pattern of hyper globalization where most countries production priorities, export priorities were tied to being dependent on other countries or to supply to other countries. If China was exporting far more than what it was importing, and that trade surplus was an important element for keeping a larger amount of dollars that it has in its foreign currency reserves to get more confident, um, or more confident spread on having larger dollar reserves. That is going to change. And the term where we can probably use, and I'm going to use two terms, deglobalization and reglobalization. So deglobalization largely means that the knob of globalization, which I'm saying is as real as what it is going to probably turn its knob a little bit more towards the left. It's going to come or reduce in terms of its dependency. Some countries may revisit their global health priorities, or sorry, global commitments and global trade partnerships, and may be more withdrawing of extensive partnerships with given nations, right? that some country may use this opportunity to re-globalize or reprioritize their commitment. So that's the point where we look at how you can always utilize a crisis for an opportunity. I mean, in the economics vocation, or economists often argue that the general job of economists is to be able to prepare nations to be able to address a crisis better. I used to often joke about this, that a lot of the work that we generally tend to do is that of what vultures try to do is identify dead economies, or those economies in an extremely fragile condition, look at what problems they're facing, and see that, for one given nation not to experience that, these are the tools that they need to, or these are the reforms, or these are the policies they need to keep to shock absorb if tomorrow there's a crash that happens, or there's a crisis that happens. This crisis is unprecedented. We've already discussed that the impact of this crisis operates in two polar and simultaneously operating forces. One is that of a healthcare crisis, and one is that of an economic crisis, and both are operating at the same time. So, what kind of an opportunity does some countries have to be able to utilize this chance to re-globalize their priorities? Before we get into that, I wanted to display this very interesting um, chart, which is pointing out at risk scores of the vocations that are most likely to find themselves to see a loss in jobs, right, in the immediate, or let's say in the medium term, of at least a couple of years or period of time. So you would find on the y axis, it denotes annual income. This is in the context of the US. As I said earlier, the US has perhaps the best data on employment, and it's something which I hope countries can tend to learn from, because we just don't have those numbers in context to many other countries, right? The x-axis is giving you a score on the risk occupation. So the occupation which has the highest amount of risk, you'll find, is going to be towards the right side, and with the highest amount of risk in terms of loss of jobs, you'll see that the bubble is larger in size. So why risk is higher towards vocations like physicians, healthcare? Because they're at the front line, right? They, most of them right now, are facing and responding to this healthcare crisis, and they are the ones that are exposed to maximum amount of risk. So the likelihood of them losing jobs or even losing lives is the highest, right? So that's why the risk component, you see that they're right on the x-axis chart. But if you look at the size of bubbles on those at the lower risk occupations, when I say risk occupations, most of these occupations where you think of computer programmers, taxi drivers, retail salesperson, they're almost out of job right now, in the sense they're not working on a day-to-day basis, or they're working largely from home, or some of them are working in essential line of supplies only. So they are at the risk of, I mean, they're at the lesser risk of not being at the front line, but they are at the risk of losing jobs, right? So the size of the bubble matters. I'll just probably ask you to be able to take a look at it carefully for a few seconds, and then let me take the discussion forward here. As you would be probably noticing, uh, flight attendants, uh, bus drivers, receptionists, cashiers, retail salespersons, most of these are at the vulnerable end of losing a job right now. Retail, a sector like retail, which is dependent on its supply chains for goods and services from within the country, different states, and from countries outside, that sector or that segment of the economy is going to largely be affected. Think of media and entertainment, think of sports. These are areas which are going to be largely affected. We discussed the sectoral allocation of the impact of the shock, if you recall, in the last lecture. This time I was looking at specific vocations and the task content of the work that I'm looking at. So this is an interesting way of understanding who's at more amount of risk right now. in terms of mostly medically being at risk of from the perspective of addressing the pandemic, but also in terms of losing his or her job. All right, so let's come to the point that I was saying is mostly connected with the valve of globalization. For some countries, the valve is going to move towards deglobalization modes. For some, it's going to move towards deglobalization mode. You'd see that there is the plus sign, or alternatively the negative sign, which denotes depending on the choices each country makes, right? Some countries can use this crisis as an opportunity to be able to reprioritize the global commitments. I've argued, for example, India has almost a golden opportunity now to invest itself as becoming a major provider for generic pharmaceutical drugs. It has always done that, but to scale it up to a larger proportion, it has already been supplying, due to its advantage of being a larger manufacturer of hydroxychloroquine, um, a lot of the drugs to other countries. It has also the opportunity in the next few years to increase more affordable testing capacity in other countries, particularly developing countries. So it's a positive if it's conceived by the choice and priorities in terms of policies, and that could allow one to reglobalize, right? Than just deglobalize or withdraw itself from partnerships with the rest of the world. So I'll discuss these in two parts, and we'll have a further or larger discussion on this probably on Monday, because I want to look again. As I said, this is not coming from a textbook explanation of what is happening. Again, these are discussion points based on what I'm observing and reading, to be able to see and look at the trends. It's also been argued extensively by scholars right now. You can probably read a little bit from the articles that have come out in, or commentaries that have come across by scholars like Joseph Stiglitz, Danny Roderick, Paul Krugman, some of them who've been talking about how de or reglobalization may or may happen. The reglobalization term has not come. I think mostly the discussion has been mostly on deglobalization. So deglobalization basically would simply means there would be revised priorities and commitments of nation states. The first one singular impact you're seeing that right now, if you just look at the facts as the way they are, is that a direct dependence on a singular commodity export good like oil is likely to change. You are seeing now oil exporting nations or countries as part of the OPEC are almost experiencing the worst possible crisis that they ever felt. I never imagined in my entire lifetime so far that I would ever imagine the price of oil or crude oil to come down to zero or negative. The negative cost is, it's interesting because most countries are reaching the optimal capacity or the maximum capacity of the storage ability, and they cannot cut down production for too long. They're now entertaining future contracts, that is by almost paying people to buy oil from them. So, and that's something which is totally unheard of, right? The petrodollar market is the very basis of how the United States created um, almost a sustainable artificial demand for the dollars in the developing world, and in the whole, almost the entire of the rest of the world landscape, because every country does import or is dependent on some amount of oil from, or crude oil, or some oil or petroleum product, and the valuation of that was done in dollar, right? That was the arrangement that a lot of the OPEC countries and the United States has. Now we're in a situation that any country which was largely dependent on oil as primary export, think of Nigeria, think of Venezuela, think of Saudi Arabia, think of most countries, or even to a certain extent Russia, any country which was largely getting its revenue from exports in certain commodities will or will need to reorient their export priorities, right? This doesn't happen overnight. You cannot change your export baskets right away. This is going to change and structurally cause a lot of countries to reorient, reprioritize their production patterns, invest a lot more in the ability to provide for other trade elastic products. That means keep if I'm exporting 100 products and if 80% of them were related to oil, Now that proportion has to come down so that other uh, products can also be prioritized. But these are based on cost benefit analysis, right? Whether you can produce something at a competitive edge, which is at a lower price and can be imported by another country. So the first deglobalizing effect that we are seeing is the direct dependence on singular commodity export goods like oil is going to come down, and that's something which is going to happen. The second point is the point which I think most of you as IR students and students of global affairs are already aware, is the question of China and China's own relationship with many of the countries in the developed world. I'm very carefully using my word that the developed world here means the world which has already industrialized to a certain extent, has a robust macroeconomic landscape, and was not overtly dependent um, on China to the extent that it cannot disengage. It can by using, for example, the US does import largest amount of products from China, but it is also one of the largest or the world's most financially powerful nation. So it also has the capacity to pass on certain sanctions. Sorry, not using the word sanctions, but I would use the word probably restrictions in form of tariffs. And that's what you saw with the trade war that happened between the US and China relationship. But China needs the US, and US needs China to a certain extent as well in terms of the immediate partnerships that it has. No matter what one president or one leader makes a statement of, we have to be careful in how we interpret it, because right now, for almost all medical supplies, China is right now the major actor doing that, right? But from testing kits to masks to private protective gear, the major supplier of that in the rest of the world, including in countries like Canada, United States, has been China, right? But once the storm passes by, once the crisis is or we are towards the other side of the curve, and the deaths start reducing, and there's more of a permanent cure that is found, you will see that countries and will disengage from China in terms of having a direct, overt dependence in terms of trade, in terms of manufacturing operations, in terms of capital interests. Japan is already making that effort. It's paying its firms to get out from China. South Korea is doing and offering the same. It is now in conversations with India to be able to have some of its plants working here or operating out from here. US is already in that situation, largely because of the leadership, but also this back and forth. You know, it's popular also to attack China, and that is something which the American political landscape does. It's not too different back in India as well. I mean, there's this tendency from a majority to attack what's we seen as Chinese, but our political narrative has changed a lot. We don't really take actions as even if what the general public sentiment may be. If the general public sentiment is against or anti-Chinese as to speak, or our political actions in terms of withdrawal or not being dependent on China is not the same. We are also getting almost all our testing kits right now, which have been found to be extremely faulty, and in recent cases of some I think antibody tests that were happening, most of those are coming from China itself. The European Union, so we saw Germany, for example, Angela Merkel making a statement that China needs to come out clean on the side of the crisis, be more transparent about the virus. So the lack of transparency, a very higher authoritarian regime and rule, those questions which were put on the side because of a greater economic interdependence on China will somewhere come out more strongly. The developed world has the luxury to do that because it has the capacity to be able to reorient its trade commitments and trade priorities. It's not easy; it takes a while, but they are in a better position to do so. However, we might see a larger or more engagement of certain countries with China, and this is something which I've read in recent column as well, that we have a situation now that many developing countries who are not like, think of a country like Oh, think of a country like Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines. Many countries in Southeast Asian region which already had a huge dependence on China cannot find it very easy to disentangle or decouple that easily. In fact, they see themselves as very closer allies to what their dependence on China is for basic intermediate products, for almost necessary goods. And that means that China's ability to engage with rest of the world is going to be conditional on the macroeconomic foundations. We were seeing this. I'll probably finish the sentence and I'll come back to this. That China's ability to I would say, imagine its relationship with the rest of the world will focus on the macroeconomic fundamentals of developing nations. After the COVID-19 crisis, many countries would be in need of capital investment to rebuild their economies. They will be in requirement for greater amounts of foreign direct investment, and China has the capital to be able to do it. China's firm has the capital to do it. It can borrow excessively internally, and it has done so. And that's one of the reasons that it has one of the largest amounts of debt to GDP ratios now in almost the whole world, apart from countries like the US. So many debt-ridden countries, many developing nations with weak macroeconomic foundations will be involved with a greater associative role with China, at almost at the cost of what China's state or state policy might be. ASEAN nations, I don't see much of a change. Parts of West, East, North, or South of Africa, I would say similarly, even if countries might want to take a hardened stand, there has to be an equal opposite offering the same set of resources at the same cost and price. And that we don't have a clear, because US has generally been withdrawing itself from very strategically in different parts of the rest of the world. That is not likely to go away anytime soon. The European Union is also in a very weak regional position right now. The very future of the EU is something that is extremely fragile, given the fact that a lot of its own countries now are facing a high amount of debt and have a very poor economic situation to deal with. And more importantly, and the last point that you need to look at within this is the concept that I think long time back Roderick had argued is connected with the scenario of premature deindustrialization. So, as you would see, a lot of countries like India, countries like Brazil, countries like Mexico, never saw that they industrialized or had a manufacturing capacity of their right optimal level reached. They started industrializing their industry to, or industrial production or growth to GDP levels started rising over a period of time, but then almost started flattening out. This concept is generally defined as premature deindustrialization. That is to say, deindustrialization is a natural occurrence because as we study in structural transformation, um, people move from agriculture to factories, from factories to service sector jobs over a period of time. And during the industrial revolution, this used to happen almost at a 40 to 50-year period. That means across generations. Grandfather or grandparents could be in agriculture, parents could be in industry or factories, kids would be working in service sector industries like a bank, consultancy. But some countries started seeing this change happening in a very short period of time. China is a good example as well here. It started seeing structural transformation of people moving from agriculture to factories to almost service sector jobs in almost a decade time, not generation. But while the trajectory was seen from one sector to another, in some cases, for example, a good example here is that of India. We never saw people moving out from agriculture completely and moving then towards, like in a larger proportion, and moving towards factories or factory based employments or manufacturing based employments, and then move towards services. In fact, what we saw was with the early reforms in the early 90s, service sector got a boost due to a greater amount of capital mobility through more open FDI policy in case of banking, in case of telecom, in case of financial services, in case of shipping, defense. Most of these areas, when they started getting more capital, that areas of activity started getting more priorities, right? While a lot of the workforce still remained in agriculture, and very limited part of people have been in manufacturing. So deindustrialization that happens more gradually as part of structural transformation would become or experience a premature deindustrialization phase once you've jumped out very quickly from a agrarian economy to, let's say, a service sector economy, which also results in higher amounts of inequities, because the income that a person working in a bank may be getting, or as a farmer you would be getting with lesser land, or someone who's working in a factory may be getting, will be very highly disproportionate, right? As structural transformation happens, the number of people working in agriculture goes down, but those who are working in agriculture, let's say in the US, you have lesser people working in agriculture, but those who are working, they own massive amount of land, and their production scale is extremely high. So that allows them to scale up production and get a larger amount of revenue, right? They're almost as entrepreneurs do in other cases like factories or manufacturing of steel. But if the transformation has happened in a level where some sectors have got a boost and the another sector has not been able to see transition of people to move away from that, that would result in a scenario of premature deindustrialization. So I'll probably suggest that you should look at this term more extensively. There's also, if you're looking at the Indian context and our discussion in India, you could probably go on Google and write premature deindustrialization and my name along with it, and you'll find one detailed column which including the references to the papers that discuss premature deindustrialization. I explained there how in India's context we've been experiencing that for a period of time. So nations, point being, nations experiencing this scenario of premature deindustrialization or experiencing a high amount of debt, or is already in a very directly tied up relationship with China in terms of trade, in terms of dependence, and would require a huge amount of capital mobility to rebuild itself after the crisis, those nations will see a greater engagement. I think China is aware of those priorities. So I think that's why it's trying to reposition itself in trying to help more. The final point, this is more of a political economy angle, is that whether, and that's a question that we have to really ask, is whether there's this coercive authoritarianism that is likely to rise. I'm using the word coercive authoritarianism because authoritarianism, like democracy, is as well, has its own elements and its own degrees. Some may argue that you may have an authoritarian regime, but it may be largely centralized, but there might be more adequate flow of information across different parts of the governance. There might be more decentralized, at least political structure or machinery in place, and you can a more heavily or highly or top hand or coercive authoritarian regime would be largely rank on the top. So in China's context, it would be largely seen as one which is pursuing more coercive authoritarian measures. You won't have um, the kind of rights or civil freedoms to be able to challenge or the notion of the state, and it's largely governed by a single party system. India's context is very different. I'll probably save ourselves from the discussion here. But my argument here is that as nation states generally start becoming, and this was a tendency happening in the pre-coronavirus scenario as well, that you were having nation states getting more and more interested in pursuing authoritarian or showing authoritarian tendencies. You were seeing a democratic backsliding of sorts in many major democracies in the world. This may or may not redefine, and that's why I'm saying it may define or redefine the rest of the world and China relations at time. So Trump, for example, will continue attacking China, right? That's something because he knows that there is a voter base that he caters to, which is very anti-Chinese, and is critical of the Chinese establishment. So in an election year, it seems mostly a viable or a smart political strategy to do it. But whether it's a smart economic strategy or economically it's something which helps the US or not, It's a separate discussion. So I urge most of you to think about these points, right? How each of these points are questions in front of nation states today. When I'm talking nation states, I'm not talking about, so the idea of nation states is also very interesting because it's a very Europeanized term. Nation states almost think of homogenized people as part of a national identity, having one singular kind of state, so nation states. In this case, it's again very different. We have many different kinds of nationalisms of sorts, right? It's regional nationalism, cultural nationalisms, linguistic nationalisms. There's so much of multifaceted sense of people that there's no one singular nation state to speak of. One might argue that we are moving a little more towards demonstrating a strong majoritarian or a singular nationalistic identity that is in construction or in formation. But that's something which is happening as part of different tendency and different regimes and different periods of time of political shifts. The question you have to ask yourself is, how are each of these countries, if let's say you don't like to use the term nation state, then each of the countries, how they're going to revisit their own priorities in terms of production, exports, partnerships with other countries, and largely looking at the China question, right? The other element as part of the deglobalization study is that when you see a huge rise in coercive authoritarianism, or I'll probably start with an example. In case of the Latin America of the 1930s, you started seeing a huge amount of shift from decreasing countries of Latin America, let's say Chile, Peru, to a certain extent, I would say Argentina, Mexico, to reduce its dependence on the United States. Because after the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and a few other measures that the United States took, a lot of Latin American countries were almost in a worse off condition. And they pursued, and they started seeing a rise in a high conservative movement, which had a combination of what you would call as both political nationalism and economic nationalism, which argued for decreasing dependence on American products. Think of, for example, Castro's Cuba, right? Less dependence on America, but then imposing or introducing what you would consider as an import substitution strategy to industrialize. So I'm not going to import end-to-end products from the US, but I may import in some other countries certain raw materials to be able to substitute for import, but industrialize and produce within the domestic territory of the country. In theory, this sounds great, but in practice, a lot of countries were not able to do it. That's why, as a result, you found many Latin American countries moving towards strong coercive authoritarian paths, but on very less economic growth. Trade substitution effect actually tends to work more on more elastic products. That means if my dependency, so if I'm importing a product whose demand changes greatly, if the price changes, that's more elastic, right? If the demand or the quantity demanded of a product does not change with its change in effect in price, think of salt, think of onion, basic necessities or goods, that would be seen as inelastic. So in trade, it works the same way. If I'm importing a product from another country which is inelastic in its demand, the trade substitution effect or the imposition of the import substitution industrialization strategy may not work that well. Because unless and until I do not replace the product by having an effective substitute there, the inelastic demand would make it very difficult for people to not consume that, right? But if you're a country which is importing products which are largely elastic in demand, there is a possibility to substitute and maybe develop partnership with other countries to reprioritize your trade arrangements. The key here is that intermediate products are very important. What are intermediate products? Some of you would know. the raw materials that is used in a further stage of production. So I would require fertilizers that would help me to allow for manufacturing to take place in agricultural or allied activities. And their fertilizer would be seen in some cases a raw material, but if it is a machine that is helping me to finish my you know crop cultivation pattern and making the crop ready, that would be seen as part of an intermediary product. The textbook example is often used as that of wheat and flour. So wheat would be seen as a raw material in the manufacturing of bread, but flour can be used as both an end product of consumption and also in the manufacturing of bread as well. To give you an example, India, for example, has a lot of dependency on compressors and conditioners from China, which are used then in the manufacturing of, let's say, air conditioners. So we depend on the major part of the compressor to come in, and we utilize that to be able to, and that's one of the reasons why that many countries were not able to increase the manufacturing of ventilators, right? Even if they had companies to be able to do so, because these companies who were into manufacturing of ventilators, including companies in India, the United States, and in Canada, they were dependent on intermediate products, which they needed to increase their production of ventilators from China itself. So unless those intermediate products don't come in, you cannot manufacture the end product. The same goes for many drugs. You may require certain salts that may be required in manufacturing of certain drugs or in pharmaceuticals. And that's where that's something for which you may be dependent on. So I think the key here is, if you're not the larger point being, if you're not dependent on trade from a particular country in a product which is inelastic in nature, is not an intermediate product, the opportunity for you to substitute or ensure a trade substitution effect or move towards import substitution industrialization is far more, right? As against a country which is dependent on inelastic products, cannot see a change in its demand with the result in price for a period of time. I'm not saying that there's no effect at all, but a marginal increase or decrease in price does not cause a change in quantity demanded. And if the nature of the demand, export demand and export supply coming in from a particular country is of intermediate products, which help you then manufacture end products in your own country, import substitution industrialization as a strategy or the trade substitution effect may not work for a good long period of time. You would require structural reforms that would take, I would say, almost a decade or more for countries to be able to change it. So it's a very uh, difficult terrain to be in. You might decide politically that you want to move away from your dependence from one countries, but it may be difficult for you to do that, actually, depending on what your trade basket is. A critical point here is many countries need to invest in their own indigenous research and development investments. These need to be in areas of priority. uh, the focus on scientific innovation through higher education and other industrial developments needs to be of priority, and so does need to be the need to patent or gain from intellectual property rights, right? Unless these things are not happening, you will always have another market which is far more sophisticated, far more technologically developed, far more integrated with the rest of the world, to be able to dictate new terms. I mean, to give you an example, in big tech, if you look at, if you have 5G and you have 5G as a competitive advantage, which is the critical war between US and China right now, right? Who has that degree of tech advantage, given the fact that the future of internet and internet's penetration and the ability to develop or may have major developments in AI and automation is dependent on 5G, and 5G's penetration is a critical point that one needs to look at. If a country is not having that technological capacity, you will be far more vulnerable on other countries. Let me move now towards the other aspect of our discussion, which is that of reglobalization. Um, So the discussion on reglobalization is largely connected with um, looking at the fact whether there are certain opportunities within the current crisis that has allowed certain countries to look at revisiting their priorities. I would say uh, there's a discussion that you have largely, I think this is something which is discussed in international political economy a lot, is the concept of global common public goods or global common goods. These are in areas which are considerable priorities for any nation, right? Irrespective of which stage of development it is: healthcare, security, education, now climate change, sustainable development goals. It is possible that these will now take far greater precedence. I mean, particularly healthcare security in the post COVID-19 world. I would say education is critical also, because now we're seeing the transition to online education, the focus on what kind of education that helps allow for a scientific aptitude to develop in many countries. Let's say even in fields of medical science, in teams of in biological areas, industry, most of those will take precedence. Climate change, I've already given you an idea that a lot of countries may want to focus on renewables. I'm actually split on this. I'm not sure right now, because given the fact that the global supply of oil has outdone its demand, at least in the short to medium term, many countries would want to utilize this cheap oil facility to increase their production. So I don't think that oil dependent production, as soon as things start returning to better normalcy in manufacturing, is going to go away, and you'll just see a rapid shift towards renewables. It will be gradual, and I think the focus on renewables is a emphasis that is dependent on what the political will of a particular nation is. If there is a will to move towards renewables and do away from non-renewables, then it becomes far easier. Otherwise, with countries with a very limited amount of or limited stage of development and being largely dependent on things like coal, oil, carbon products, if there is oversupply and there's less demand right now, the idea would be to utilize that supply and reshift its production probably at a later point of time. There's also a term which we often use now in a lot of the sustainable development or international development literature, that is that of degrowth. We're already seeing that the level of growth that nations were experiencing in the post 2008 financial world was not nowhere similar to the same level of growth that they had far before. I think that pattern is likely to continue. You're no longer going to see very high amount of rates of growth like 10%, 15%, 12%, or 8% nominal growth rates very quickly. It is going to take a long period of time, and hence any economic recovery from a crisis like the current one is unlikely to be v-shaped. I discussed this last time, that the current fall is almost an I, and it will take certain countries from this steep fall, in whether it's in loss of employment, loss of economic activity, loss of growth. This fall is going to gradually look at how countries respond. They see a certain flattening and then probably start going up, but the rate is not likely to be go. So this, there can be a U depending on how policies come about, but definitely not a V where you see just a fall and a sudden spark rise. So degrowth means that the level of growth across countries is going to be lesser in its actual numbers as against to other things. This is also something which is a separate, complete subject and area of discussion. So if you're not too clear, I would say that read a little bit about what degrowth generally means. A lot of people talk about degrowth and the value of degrowth in context to environment sustainability, where you reduce production or reduce consumption to be able to ensure that you have a much more ecological or ecosystem or a habitable ecosystem. A good example of a successful degrowth model, as to speak of, would be an example that of Bhutan. right? A country which has been able to manage its forest cover, but also been able to see a certain amount of rise in per capita incomes over a period of time. Nowhere similar to other countries, but has not entered into a serious recession or a crash. They've always had this a kind of a more sustainable strategy. So in re-globalization, the direction of public policies is very important, and there is a need for investing in soft power through medical diplomacy and educational diplomacy. I think for India, these are the two big areas. There's no denying that we have a competitive or comparative advantage in pharmaceutical exports, in areas of medical tourism, and also in areas of having technical expertise in private sector lab and testing. We just need to be able to have put more public attention towards it. That's attention in terms of public health and the state priorities, to be able to make its reach go out. We've already seen that US has been able to get the maximum, what I would say, if you see labor markets as part of an export import basket, then a lot of the doctors and engineers have almost been quote unquote exported in the skilled labor category in the US. This is going to change because with tough immigration laws, inflexible labor market chains, that is something which, immigration has been a subject which has allowed that hyper nationalistic sentiment to rise in many countries, back in Europe to the United States. It may allow you to retain that skilled labor and then prioritize your comparative advantage there. Education, because India has the capacity, because of its large domestic demand, to be able to provide to become become a major destination in higher education, and that's something which is worth pursuing. The areas of monetary and fiscal policy changes need to be aligned in these areas if you want to re-globalize. Because unless you don't have a monetary policy, something we're going to discuss in this course, so you'll come back to that maybe in the forthcoming week. Fiscal policy largely looks at government spending, government revenue, taxation, the kind of incentives you're offering. Those questions are critical, right? For the state to be able to see or give the private sector an idea of what it wants you to prioritize on. Oh, we want you to export if you are this particular company and you're producing these particular products. That is directionally provided not in counseling, but to the kind of incentives you offer in taxes, in terms of I feel that we need to revisit our special economic zone policy, which needs to now have a greater emphasis on having economic zones within states, so that they also act as not only economic zones for exports, but also economic zones for employment within the state, to attract greater employment within certain areas. So that's likely to be an important area to look at in the next few months and years. The macro fundamentals, that's the last point in the slide that is critical, is very important. As I argued, that if your macro fundamentals are extremely weak, you're then much more vulnerable to a exogenous or an external shock, or an external partner which may want to invest greatly in you. So think of China's relationship with that of Pakistan or Sri Lanka in the South Asia region. Pakistan was having, or has been having, a very high amount of debt, and has not been able to find greater amount of investment coming from other countries, or generate enough domestic investment capacity in infrastructural development. So CPEC came as a project where China invested massively to allow for that investment in infrastructure to go up. As a result of that, that shifts and has concerns of debt and debt accumulation in the host country, which is receiving the investment. The same thing happened in the port city of Colombo in Sri Lanka. You had massive Chinese investment over through a line of credit and loan. When Sri Lanka government made an intention that it cannot probably pay that money given the fact of its own fiscal capacity, China almost now owns the major part of the port city town area, that it is now almost constructing a port industrial town. I think it's a residential and industrial colony. that they're trying to construct. So macro fundamentals matter. What's your inflation rate like? How much of your workforce participation rate is performing? Particularly in India's case, for example, female to male participation rate is very critical. We have extremely low, lesser than 30% on an average participation of women in the organized workforce participation rate, and that needs greater attention. Debt management, we'll see the debt numbers very soon on why that's a major concern. The trade deficit should not be huge. If you, unless and until you're in the United States, which is having a currency which is the world's reserve currency, deficits for them don't seem to matter the same way as deficits matter to us. But that's it's an important element of how your fundamentals or how strong your fundamentals are. Fiscal consolidation means how prudent you are in your spending and in your. So right now in a healthcare crisis and in almost a warlike situation, you want to spend as much as possible to ensure that you respond to the crisis, ensure that your vulnerable workers are taken care of, the poor are taken care of. So right now you don't want to put too much of restraints on fiscal spending. But once you're on the other side, you want to be aware that you shouldn't have had to spend so much that there's no possibility of moving towards the path of consolidation. Flexible exchange rates are very important. I think the example from Japan and China are both important here. By keeping the value of the currency slightly devalued or lesser, you make your products more competitive in the external market. But also depends on the products, right? If you're producing something which the whole world is producing, then irrespective of what, and the quality of that product is not that good, irrespective of how cheap it may be, the demand of that may not be the same. Liquidity needs depends on the successful functioning of the financial sector market. So this slide, as you would have seen, has point out or brought out our argument in extensive detail on both these points. Whether you're likely to experience, or when I say you, I'm talking about nations are likely to experience a deglobalization of sorts in terms of revising their priorities and commitments in terms of exports, in terms of partnerships, in terms of contracts, in terms of political economy landscapes. That's something which is definitely likely to happen. And also the crisis opportunity here is for many countries to re-globalize by investing in global common public goods, investing in healthcare, investing in education, where you can allow to become a major service provider, right? Not only a service provider domestically, but also to the rest of the world. And for that, you need to look at what kind of policies you take in mind. So this is moving towards the last part of our recording and lecture for today. And here I want to take a little bit of time to discuss the concern of debt. And we'll talk about this in more detail. I also, when we'll be talking about the topics of economic crises, but there I would be probably focusing more on crisis events, that is events of crises, rather than talking about the accumulation of debt. That's something which we're discussing probably today. I've hyperlinked an essay that I'd recently written by looking at the numbers from the IMF database, which talks about looking at the concern of a massive debt crisis. This has been something which, a lot of economists, including few of us, we've been arguing that the post-2008 financial crisis environment did not see a reduction in debt. It did see a reduction or it did see a more amount of regulation on banking practices, so that there are less banking crises, there are less crises across the world, but it did not result in a reduction of debt. Debt has continued to go up, either at the level of government, either at the level of households. Household debt would be seen in terms of credit card loans or house mortgage, or you would look at people with high amount of student debt. Those are looking at components of household debt or corporate debt, where you had companies massively borrowing but not able to repay. So think of industrialists in India, massive amounts of loans but not able to repay and then going bust. So those components are very important to be able to look at as part of our discussion on debt. So these are numbers that I've been able to take out from the IMF's database, which is perhaps the only considerable global database on debt numbers, where we'll discuss probably this in around 4 critical charts. And the essay which I'm talking about, if you click on the hyperlink of this particular title, you'll be able to get it So, if you look at the period of time from the 1970s to almost 2018-19, um, another good reference if you're looking at to understand the debt issue is to be able to look at a World Bank report that came in the early part of I think 2020. This was January 2020 when Kenneth Rogoff and a couple of economists had released a study on understanding the value of debt across the world and the component of debt in emerging market economies as against the developed markets and developed economies. So that's a good study to look at. It's also hyperlinked in the essay that I had authored, so you can probably get the source from there as well. But we can also discuss if you need additional references when we connect on Monday. So just look at the numbers of debt accumulated by the private sector, the government, that is the borrowings from government from. So how does the government borrow money, right? So the government can borrow money externally through external institutions, external countries, in form of lines of credit from other countries, in form of line of credit from international institutions like the IMF, World Bank, right? Or it can borrow internally through its central bank by issuing of bonds, which can be bought by the public. So there can be new bonds as debt instruments that can be bought by the general public, and the proceeds of that money can be something that the government can utilize to be able to finance its deficit and move towards that. So there's both internal borrowing and external borrowing. Internal borrowing tends to happen mostly in domestic currency terms. So Indian government can borrow largely by issuing bonds in rupees, people buying in rupees, and as central bank probably issues that bond, it gives the government a certain amount of money. But that's also debt. That's internal debt. At some point of time, the government has to repay that money back to its bond holders, right? Depending on when the yields or the returns of the bond become to be due. The private sector, however, the private sector ownership, um, just on one thing, if you come across terms that you find and I'm using that you're not clear of, I strongly recommend, because this is the advantage you have in a recording, that you can make a note of those terms right away and probably utilize the time that you get to be able to look at platforms like Investopedia, go on YouTube and just write it across so that you understand what I'm talking about. You should know, for example, the difference between what is loan and what is a bond. Both are debt instruments, but loans are non-transferable, right? If I have taken the loan, I need to repay it. I can have a guarantor who can pay on my behalf, but I cannot sell the loan to someone else, right? Only banks can do it as part of their mortgages or assets that they want to do. But the person who's taken a loan cannot do that. Bond, in the scenario of a bond, you can, because there is a bond market. You can issue a bond. I can be the person who can sell the bond, given the fact that someone else needs to retain the money. If the government is the entity which is the bond, is the debtor, that means I have issued the bond and the government is supposed to pay me the money. I can you take this bond to the bond market and sell it to, let's say, a friend of mine, who will say, oh, who's the debtor, and say, okay, it's the government. All right, this seems like a stable investment to make. I can sell that bond to at a certain price, and my friend can buy it. So the bond trade happens in the bond market, right, as against something which doesn't happen in the loan market. So these are ways and instruments that you need to be a little bit aware of. So just please make sure that when I make a statement or a term that you're not aware of, you've not come across, you should make an effort to be able to refer to it in platforms you can. I mentioned usually Investopedia because it combines an explanation with also video, which is quite self-explanatory. So yeah, moving on, the debt that can be accumulated could be at the level of the government, it could be in the level of private sector, whether it's corporates, households. If you look at the numbers very closely, right from the 1970s, there has been a rise in the amount of total debt as against to what it was, let's say, before. But right after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, if you see, the level has really gone up. So the debt accumulation has not stopped, even if there was a crisis and the crisis response made countries to start recovering from the crisis. So this is an important chart for global economies. Let's look at the emerging markets particularly. If you look at the emerging markets, the situation is worse after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. If you look at just total amount of debt after 2010, for example, the last section, you've seen a huge accumulation of debt where governments, private sectors, most of them have been borrowing excessively. We'll come to why that has been happening, but just let's look at the trends right now. And the government has been borrowing excessively as well. Now, a country like India is a very good example. Our private investment domestically has been very low. We haven't been receiving that much of FDI as we would like to, given the fact on what the need of investment is for production. So the government spending in investment expenditure or in generally social expenditure has been perhaps the only way for the government to look at. But if the revenue is low, then the government needs to borrow more money internally or externally. Internally, it could do again, as I mentioned, through the issuing of bonds and the went through the central bank, or externally through external agencies. The question is, when you borrow through external agencies, you borrow in external currencies. And when you need to repay the money, you need to pay in that currency alone. So tomorrow, if you enter into default mode, you will, because you have less reserves of that currency and you cannot pay back in, let's say, X amount of dollars or X amount of euros. Similarly, in the internal debt scenario, you need to repay the money in your own currency. So China, for example, has one of the largest debt to GDP ratios in almost the entire world. But why is that we don't talk about it? Because China's most of its debt in its nature is internal in nature. It's in the Chinese yuan. So one question is that when you owe a lot of money to your own entities in their own currency, the government has the option of printing more and supplying it and covering for that. But you can't print excessively because that may have an issue with respect to inflation, right? So I hope you understand those links critically. If not, we'll come back to these as questions that you can raise on Monday. But I would probably urge you to look at the trends so that you understand why before the coronavirus pandemic as well, a lot of people were arguing that we might see and experience a debt deluge or debt crisis. Nobody was clear on what kind of a shock can cause that. And I think maybe this crisis alone right now has made countries to look at that point. This is another chart of emerging market developing economies where the level of debt which has been accumulated has gone significantly up in the last decade. There were previous waves as well. The wave was seen, if it was the first wave of the rise in debt was from the 1970s to the mid 1980s. Then the debt levels started going down. So the period between, I would say, early 90s and 2000 was relatively more stable. But then post 2000s, we started seeing higher amount of borrowings. And the post financial crisis scenario, that is post 2009 and 10, the level of debt accumulation across governments, the private sector has increased in huge proportions. Let's look at the region-wise distribution of debt. This is an important chart by looking at understanding how regions are more susceptible to debt shocks. East Asia Pacific, the East European context, Latin American countries, in cases of most of these regions, you'll find that across the world, the most vulnerable are those which are within the parts of Asia, um, and the least amount of debt accumulations happened in parts of the East Asian context, where the level of debt is not that high as compared to other parts. But if you look at countries like parts of Latin American region, right, it's the yellow curve, debt accumulation has been high. In fact, Latin America experienced the maximum amount of debt crises between 1970 and 1986. That's why you see that the yellow curve is so high between 1970 and 86. This is the time when Mexico was experienced the tequila crisis, late 80s, early 90s. Argentina was receiving a series of shocks. Peru, number of countries were experiencing huge amount of debt shocks. We can discuss the reasons why that happened. That's when we can probably come back to looking at the crisis and how crises are caused. But for now, I think just for awareness, it needs to be clear that the trends of region-wise debt accumulation patterns. These are numbers for government debt to GDP alone, right? Not private debt. So the government borrowings have been extremely high in countries or regions within the Latin America, in parts of East Asian Pacific, um, the South Asian, South East Asian context, and East Asia or the East European context, the numbers are relatively low. Now, why did this happen? This is one perhaps slide which I will try to summate it to give you some understanding. So let me see what is the indicator you've taken here. You've taken the indicator here, what you call as generally debt to GDP ratio, right? So what amount of debt you have as a percentage, or in the denominator, you look at your GDP growth. So if your denominator is losing its value, if your GDP growth, if your gross domestic growth, or if your production levels are going down annually, even if your debt is the same, right? If the denominator is losing value, you will automatically see that the debt to GDP ratio will go high, right? It's basic mathematics. So if the denominator is going low, if the GDP growth level is going down, even if the debt is the same in value, uh, the debt to GDP ratio will look higher. So one problem for a higher debt accumulation happening in certain countries is, even if they have not borrowed excessively, just the fact that they've been experiencing low growth, right, or been experiencing degrowth, have been able to see a higher accumulation of debt. The second point is that even if your debt, if you're borrowing more as a private sector, corporate, households, um, I mean, to give you a household example, I can be spending a lot of my money through credit card, but my ability to use that power of credit, right, to my advantage is conditional on how much of income I'm getting. If my income start thinning out, if my income start reducing, and I'm still continuing with the same amount of credit card expenditure, this credit will naturally turn into a certain amount of debt, right? So if your borrowing is high, but your incomes are low, your growth levels are low, debt accumulation will go up. And this is what started happening in the post-financial crisis scenario. In the post-financial crisis scenario, if you'll observe closely from post-2010, debt started going up. Most financing of growth was happening on credit. Governments were borrowing way more. Incomes were not rising at the same level. Growth was not at the same level. But they were doing so because they had to still do it to ensure that there is some amount of growth that is taking place. And that caused a huge mismatch between the debt and growth story, right? And that's one of the critical factors. Now, another factor is, why do you see such a high amount of private debt, right? If you go back to the story here, a huge amount of debt that is being accumulated now is in the form of private debt and government debt. And that's happened because banks, after the financial crisis, particularly in markets within the European Union, the American context, Japanese context, were moving towards a monetary policy system which encouraged cheap borrowing. That means to say that banks were encouraging more and more corporates to borrow more, precisely because they wanted them to invest in more capacity to increase growth areas. So that happens primarily, and this is going to be much clearer to you when you look at monetary policy. But what you need to just know is that if you take one indicator as an example, that is the long-term interest rate trend. The long-term interest rate trend is an element which helps, which gives you an idea of the long-term borrowing power, or the long-term cost of borrowing from a commercial bank, right? So if you're reducing your interest rate, that means this is the interest rate that we're talking about as the cost of borrowing. We're not talking about here the interest rate as the interest rate on deposits. So if I'm making a deposit in a bank and I'm getting a higher interest rate, that means I have an incentive to put that money in the bank rather than keeping it with me, right? But here we're not talking about that interest rate. We're talking about always in monetary policy, we talk about interest rate as incapacity of interest rate as cost of borrowing. That means the loan that I'm taking from the bank, or the debt that I'm taking from the bank or credit that I'm taking from the bank, the interest rate on that. So if for a credit card payment, if the interest rate on a credit card payment is, let's say, 10%, I will not make a payment by credit card. I'd rather prefer it to make by cash. But what if a bank is saying, well, there is no interest rate or cost on making a payment by credit card? So I would almost use it transferably. I would use plastic money transferably as with cash, right? And that's something which has started happening. Most banks have encouraged credit card use, right? So the long-term interest rate going down means most of the commercial banks, with the support of the central bank in the post-financial crisis world, were given an incentive to be able to borrow cheaply. In advanced economies, this was far more. So in fact, the blue line that you see is for advanced economies where interest rates had come down as close as possible to zero. That means that almost you can borrow for free, no interest rate on any loan. That was done as part of the monetary policy of the United States when the situation was really bad after the financial crisis. Countries like Japan have been having negative interest rates. That means banks have been giving more incentives for people to borrow money rather than charging them as a loan, right? In emerging market economies, you've also seen a similar strategy where banks have given more incentives for corporates to borrow money, and there's been cheaper borrowing. This means more credit, and if the credit is not actualizing to greater growth, it will start turning into a amount of debt. So the chart here, which is the first chart of the second chart, are connected. Low growth, high borrowing, right? And that culminating into a greater amount of debt. That cycle is something which one needs to understand. All of this has played down or played out before the coronavirus pandemic. So right now, current countries are in a situation where they're already sitting on a high pile of debt. They don't have the fiscal capacity to monetize. They can't print as much as they can because that can just explode the debt situation. And advanced economies may be in a situation to manage the resources better, but in developing countries, if they are, or the emerging market developing economies, if the debt level is extremely high, it makes them more and more vulnerable to a debt crisis. So with that, I would want to probably bring our discussion or our lecture recording for this week to a close. I would want you to look at all of the points that we discussed uh, today and take a good look at the recording, probably take some time to be able to go through this a couple of times. We've discussed quite a bit. Some of the points may be a bit more technical. I would want to make you, make notes out. The questions you want to raise, let's put the questions out on Monday morning. I'll start with the questions there itself. I will not repeat the lecture, so I'll keep myself more coordinated on the questions and queries you may have. But my earnest appeal to you is please take time out to look at each of the points that we have discussed. And with this, probably we'll come to the end of our discussion on COVID-19 and great lockdown. I thank you, and I look forward to receiving any comments that you may have on the recordings shared so far via email. Thank you.